So, while everyone was scrolling past holiday memes, the United States bombed a facility in South America. Trump admitted it on live radio, and nobody is talking about it. This isn't just a war on drugs, it's a phantom war for oil that's happening right now, and it's the single biggest threat to Canada's economy since NAFTA. No UN vote, no debate in Congress, just a president bragging that he took out a dock facility and seized ships on the high seas.
So today we're going to show you why this blockade in Venezuela isn't that far away. It's a direct attack on heavy oil markets that keeps Canada's economy alive. And we are next.
Because this isn't just about boats and cartels. It's about power, oil, and how much control Canada actually has over its own future. We're going to break down the strikes at sea, the dock facility, the tankers, and then we're going to follow the money trail straight from Venezuela's coast to Alberta's oil patch to Canada's sovereignty.
But before we talk about oil maps and Canada, let's rewind. What has Trump actually been doing on that water? Because this didn't start with one dock, it started with a quiet little shooting war at sea.
Since early September, and as recently as last night, the Trump administration has been running Operation Southern Spear, where the U.S. military has carried out around 30 strikes on boats it says were smuggling drugs in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. By their own numbers, more than 100 people have been killed in these attacks.
These aren't court cases. There's no judge, no jury, no lawyers. A boat gets flagged as narco, an airstrike takes it out, and then the U.S. officials post the footage on social media like it's a highlight reel. Families in Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago, and Venezuela say some of those narco-terrorists were just fishermen who never came home.
And now, Trump says they've moved from boats to infrastructure. First, he phones into a radio show and brags that there's a big plant or facility where these ships come from, and that 2 nights earlier the U.S. knocked that out. And that would already be bad enough if this was only about small boats and one mystery dock, but it isn't. It's also about giant oil tankers, seized cargo, and a blockade that nobody voted for.
Because while all that is happening, the U.S. has quietly flooded the region with troops and warships. They're parking naval power right off the Venezuela's coast. And on top of that, Trump has announced what he calls a blockade of sanctioned oil tankers going in and out of Venezuela. In practice, that means U.S. forces intercept tankers carrying Venezuelan crude, label the cargo sanctioned, and in some cases take control of the ships themselves.
One tanker, the Centuries, was on its way to China with almost 2 million barrels of Venezuelan crude when the U.S. grabbed it off the coast and called it part of a shadow fleet. China's foreign ministry called that a serious violation of international law and said seizing another country's ship like that is not acceptable.
They followed up with angry statements at the UN and high-level calls to Caracas, but so far it's been diplomatic, which from Washington's point of view is basically a green light to keep pushing the line.
A whole chunk of Venezuelan oil is now stuck on ships. Buyers are demanding deeper discounts because the voyages are now risky, and Caracas is calling this international piracy.
Russia's foreign minister even said that Washington's actions in the Caribbean are reviving piracy and banditry at sea, and warned this could have serious consequences for regional security and shipping.
So on one side, you had the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard seizing oil tankers and blowing up alleged drug boats, and on the other side, you have China and Russia publicly backing Venezuela and accusing Washington of lawlessness. That's not a normal trade spat here, people. That's a superpower confrontation wrapped around one country's oil. Legal experts who have looked at this kind of thing before are pretty blunt. If you're destroying infrastructure on another state's territory without their consent, and there's no UN mandate, that almost always qualifies as an illegal use of force. And if you're boarding and confiscating foreign vessels on the high seas based only on your sanctions, that stops looking like law enforcement and starts looking a lot like piracy.
Inside the United States, presidents get away with a lot by calling everything self-defense or national security. They call this an armed conflict with drug cartels, wrap it in emergency powers, and rely on the fact that Congress hasn't pushed back on this kind of mission creep in decades.
So internationally, this looks illegal. Domestically, it's one more example of a president stretching his powers while Congress mostly stands and looks at their shoes. But legality is only part of the story. Because we also need to ask, why is Washington willing to take on China, Russia, and half of the UN over Venezuelan oil? Well, that's where Canada enters the picture.
When you look at who holds the biggest proven oil reserves in the world, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Canada, Russia, it's not hard to see why they keep showing up on Washington's radar. If you line those up and then ask, where has the US put sanctions, interventions, or problems for decades? Well, you're basically reading from the same list, and that's not a coincidence.
And now look at where Trump is actually dropping bombs and running operations in 2025. Nigeria, Africa's biggest oil producer. Venezuela, sitting on the largest proven reserves in the world. And the country he keeps threatening to annex? Canada. Different continents, same pattern. If there's oil or leverage, Washington turns it into a security problem. And remember, Trump used our less than 45 pounds of fentanyl seized at our border to declare a national security emergency about Canada. That wasn't the finale. That was just the test run.
At the top of that list, though, is Venezuela, with the largest proven reserves of crude oil in the world. Most of it is extra heavy crude in the Orinoco Belt. It's thick, sulfur-heavy, and needs specialized refineries.
Sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly the kind of oil Canada produces in Alberta. Energy analysts have been saying for years that Venezuelan heavy crude is Alberta's biggest competitor.
And that's the part almost nobody mentions when they talk about drug boats and corruption in Caracas. If Washington can shape what happens in Venezuela, whether that's through regime change, a forced deal, or permanent sanctions that give U.S. firms special access, then they don't just get to posture as the drug police. They get a giant lever over the heavy oil market.
And that lever sits right next to the Gulf of Mexico, a short sail away from U.S. refineries that already love heavy crude because they can buy it cheap and sell high-margin gasoline and diesel. So if they can control Venezuelan barrels, guess whose barrels become optional? Ours. And that's Canada's fatal mistake. We built our house on their foundation.
Canada has built a huge chunk of its economy on the assumption that the United States will always need our oil. Our heavy crude goes south through pipelines, when we can get them built, to refineries in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast. We've treated that like a law of nature.
But the U.S. has already shown it will use trade rules as weapons. They slapped national security tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. They've dragged our softwood lumber industry through endless trade wars, ignoring WTO and NAFTA rulings when they lose. When we backed the Keystone XL pipeline with billions in public money and guarantees, and Washington still tore it up when it suited them.
That's the pattern as to why the U.S. does this. It's the because we can doctrine. The United States doesn't seize a tanker off Venezuela because it cares about democracy. It seizes the tanker because it can. It slaps tariffs on Canadian industries because it can. It rewrites the rules in the middle of the game because it can.
The U.S. has acted like an evil landlord to Canada who keeps raising the rent, breaking the lease, and then acting offended when you complain. And now that landlord is not just messing with lumber and metal. It's going after the world's biggest heavy oil reserve that just happens to be the twin of Alberta's.
If Washington secures cheap, easy access to Venezuelan heavy crude, here's what happens. U.S. refineries get a new source right on their doorstep. They can pressure prices down for Canadian crude, and they can threaten tariffs or security reviews anytime Ottawa gets ideas about independence.
Basically, we become the backup plan, the expensive, landlocked, easy-to-bully backup plan. And that's why you're suddenly seeing very strange alliances here in Canada. If you want proof that people in power are worried, just look at who's quietly lining up together. On one side, you have Danielle Smith in Alberta, forever yelling about Ottawa. And on the other side, you have Prime Minister Mark Carney, the calm central banker, who is obsessed with numbers and risk. Carney and Smith backing the same westward pipeline isn't about best friends singing campfire songs. It's an admission that the north-south route is becoming a trap.
So what if you're watching this from Toronto or St. John's or Quebec City? Why should you care about some dock that may or may not be in Venezuela and a bunch of tankers with names you'll never remember?
Well, 3 reasons. First, this normalizes secretive strikes and blockades in our hemisphere. If the U.S. can hit infrastructure tied to another American state, refuse to confirm details, and face almost no consequences, that chips away at the idea that smaller countries' borders actually matter.
And sure, we're not Venezuela. We're richer, we're more stable, and we're in NATO. But the precedent doesn't care. The precedent just says, if you're in the way and we can sell it as a security risk, we'll do what we want because we're America.
Second, it blurs the line between crime and war. Drug trafficking is deadly and real. People suffer from it every day. But when a president declares an armed conflict with cartels, suddenly anything from oil tankers to dock facilities can be hit with military force.
Today it's boats. Tomorrow it's something tied to migration. Next year it's something tied to critical minerals. Once everything becomes a security excuse, international law turns into just a suggestion.
And third, it gives cover to economic pressure that directly hits Canada. We've already lived through national security tariffs, we've already watched Washington weaponize trade against us, and we've watched an ally treat us like an obstacle when it suits them.
Add a Venezuelan heavy oil lever on top of that, and suddenly we're negotiating with a neighbor who can say, we have tankers, we have refineries, we have access to multiple suppliers. You have one main buyer. So how badly do you want to argue with us today, huh?
So, what can Canada do besides sitting on the couch doom scrolling? Well, we can start by being honest about the relationship. The United States can be our ally in some things, but it's our competitor in others. On resources, they're not our protective big brother. They're a country that will seize tankers, ignore rulings, and drop bombs if it suits their interests.
But we still have power. We can choose where we spend our money, where we travel, and what we normalize. We keep the boycotts going, we stay out of the US for now, and we speak out online with our friends. That's Canada quietly refusing to play along.
We can diversify where we send our energy. Pipelines and shipping routes that point to Europe and Asia aren't luxuries anymore, they're survival tools. We can push our government, any government, to treat international law as real, even when it's uncomfortable with Washington.
And we can stop treating stories like Venezuela as if they're just over there. When a president tests how far we can go in our hemisphere, seizing tankers, hitting facilities, brushing off the UN, we're not just a spectator, we're part of the experiment. So call on our news outlets to cover it properly, to connect the dots and stop pretending it has nothing to do with Canada.
Venezuela is a warning light on Canada's dashboard. Not because tanks are about to roll into Edmonton, but because it shows exactly how far Trump is willing to go for oil, control, and headlines, and how easily the rules bend when nobody pushes back. So let us know in the comments, do you think Canada should call this out more directly? Or are we already too scared of what happens if we step out of the line? And if you want this kind of thing that we're talking about today to show up into people's feeds, then there's one tiny thing that you can do.
Click the like button. Seriously, that one little click tells YouTube, hey, more Canadians and people around the world should probably see this before they wake up as someone else's colony.
Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next deep dive when Trump decides another corner of the map is his playground.
And if you want the full breakdowns and extra rants we can't always fit in a video, join us over on Substack, Unfiltered North. The link is in the description.
And for those of you who want to support this channel and keep it independent, join the A-Team. That's our YouTube membership. We really appreciate it. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about what Trump does in Venezuela. It's about what Canadians decide to do together in response.
So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.